Piet Steele. I'm the chairman of the board of Europe Asia Center. And I thank you all for taking part in this webinar. And I extend a very warm and personal welcome to our high-level discussions from Europe, and I'm very happy also from China, Dr. Wang. Earlier this year, the European Union adopted formally the Digital Markets Act, the DMA, and the Digital Services Act, the DSA, and two landmark legislative steps in its strive for Europe for more strategic autonomy and less external dependence, and mitigating vulnerabilities such as disinformation across the spectrum of digital information. And the adoption of those two acts contains a clear political signal. And the rules are set by legislators and not by private companies, as was said after the vote by Dr. Andreas Schwab, the leading member of the European Parliament working on DMA and DSA. And we are very happy to welcome here this afternoon. Unfortunately, the current geopolitical and trade tensions in the world have halted, or more optimistically, has paused the negotiations of a comprehensive trade agreement between the EU and China. Despite these challenges, it is in Europe's interest, and in China's too, to make good progress towards a structured bilateral and/or multilateral dialogue in the area of internet governances, such as it is covered by the DMA and DSA. It does not make a lot of sense to target each other's business practices, European or Chinese or American. Instead, the world's main technology providers need to talk to each other to find common ground on how technology can be an enabler for global growth, and let me add also for peace. I consider the DMA and the DSA as models of regulation which can set the standards for global cooperation. That's why I call them, without exaggeration, seminal decisions. They are supposed to safeguard the European interests and societal values in protecting them through a legislative framework. I wish they will become the model for a wider, more global cooperation among the major economic and political players in the world. Thank you for your attendance in this webinar this afternoon, and I look forward to a very fruitful and enriching discussion in the ensuing debate. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Steele, for your profound opening points. It's my true pleasure now to introduce our first keynote speaker, which will be the Honorable Member of the European Parliament, Dr. Andreas Schwab. Dr. Andreas Schwab has been the member of the European Parliament for German Christian Democratic Union, CDU, since 2004. And in the European Parliament, he was, in the context of today's conversation, also the lead rapporteur on the Digital Markets and Digital Services Act. Dr. Schwab has been a member of the European Parliament and is part of the European People's Party group, coordinator in the Committee of the Internal Market and Consumer Protection, a substitute member of the Committee on Economic and Monetary Affairs, as well as member of the Bureau of the EPP group. Prior to his election to the European Parliament, Dr. Schwab worked in legal sphere for the Ministry of Culture, Youth and Sports in Stuttgart, and as a private sector secretary to the Minister of the State. Without further ado, the virtual floor is yours, Dr. Andreas Schwab.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Steele. Thank you so much, Matic. It's my pleasure to participate in that webinar. And I think it's important, and I would like to thank the Europe Asia Center in Brussels and its chairman, that we exchange on these important points that will shape our digital cooperation and digital future, at least from the side of the European Union. And obviously, as you have already said, and I'm sure that this will also come out in the discussion, we cannot discuss about our values, but we can make legislation that enables all those that want to accept these values to participate lawfully and to, like that, enable people to get in touch with each other and to make the digital markets a new future-orientated reality that can be of use to all of us. So therefore, I would like to tell you very shortly a bit about what's the object of this legislation, especially of the Digital Markets Act. Secondly, what is the object of the Digital Services Act? And then I would like to outline a bit the global context of platform regulation, comparing it a bit with the United States. And I would then finally speak a bit about potentials of the Digital Markets Act for EU-China relations. So let me start with the objective of the Digital Markets Act. You know that in 2014 already, the European Parliament has called, based on an amendment that I have made, the European Commission to enter into the search engine markets and to make sure that the information that is displayed there is the information that is corresponding to what people look for. And as there were strong doubts about this to happen, to intervene in this market with very tough decisions. Unfortunately, we had to wait until 2021 before the European Commission came up with a very concrete proposal. And this concrete proposal is based clearly on competition policy reflections, but it's going beyond competition policy itself, because it's based on Article 114 of the treaty, which is a regulation of the single market. And by the way, it's the same for the Digital Services Act. And in the area of competition law, many issues arose with gatekeepers' business models, which undermined fair competition. And you know that fair competition for Germans, but I would also say for Europeans, is very close to the social market economy, a concept that should combine competition with some reflections about how fair competition can be done in a way to make profiting all citizens that work hard. The Digital Markets Act has now been voted, just to make that clear, and it will enter into force in May next year, where the Commission then will have to check what is a gatekeeper and will then have to establish at a later stage the rules that these gatekeepers have to respect. Now, I would like to make sure that you understand exactly what the aim of this law is. It's not just to make a law, it's a law that should make sure, or is intended to provide greater competition, meaning contestability of markets, and the level playing field in a two-sided platform markets. And that is offering chances for American businesses to American platforms, but also to European companies into European platforms or into American platforms, and for sure also far beyond, because it's the principle of contestability of market that is important, but it's a contestability which itself has to be based on fairness, on long-term investment, and on any state aids that should not jeopardize the fairness of these markets. And therefore, I think with the Digital Markets Act and the rules that we have been establishing are both together a very important step forward to achieve this, as the European Commission, as the ultimate authority to apply it, will check all these elements. And the DMA like that addresses 10 specific digital markets: browsers, app stores, operating systems, or messaging services where business consumers and end users interact. So therefore, the DMA only focuses on the biggest companies and important digital services, the so-called core platform services. A gatekeeper in that respect must have 75 billion in market capitalization, 45 million end users, and 10,000 business users per service it offers in the European Union, not counting the outside. And this will cover mostly companies from the United States, but also European companies such as Booking or maybe Alibaba. The goal, as I mentioned already, is contestability, and this should be achieved by making sure that there can be no self-preferencing anymore in these platforms that are defined here. Other platforms still can do it, but not the gatekeepers anymore. That there is a clear focus that they have to avoid any conflict of interest between the different services that they offer, and that the data leveraging, which is done by combining data across different markets, are avoided in a way that other players in the market can participate as well. And this should be achieved by the European Commission as the authority to control this and to get in touch with the companies of this size to make sure that they apply all the rules that have been established in Article 5 and 6. And a sister law to this is the so-called Digital Services Act. The Digital Services Act deals with the proliferation of illegal products, but products, it means digital products, and that means services and illegal content online. And therefore, this law sets different requirements for all online intermediaries, such as content hosts, online platforms, and very large online platforms. The difference is the DMA focuses only on a small number of players, only with the aim of competition to be fair and clear. The DSA focuses on content because illegal content has to be avoided, and illegal is mostly unlawful content, but sometimes it can also be harmful content. And that is a very difficult issue because harmful content can be something that becomes illegal after a court decision, but is not yet illegal when it's put in the platform or on the internet. Before the Digital Services Act, we had online intermediaries only as a conduit status, and this has been changed profoundly. And with this changes, the biggest problems the DSA addresses are the proliferation of illegal services and the verification of informations on these e-commerce platforms. And at the same time, it also addresses the risk of disinformation and combating illegal content, such as hate speech on large platforms. But the Digital Services Act, and that's important also as a difference to the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act does not define what is illegal. For this, it relies on the notion of legality of the member states' laws. And it builds a mechanism for authorities to cooperate in cross-border disputes. But this makes the respect of this law quite difficult because what is illegal in one member state of the European Union can be legal in another one. And therefore, in the end, you have to respect the criminal law book of all 27 member states if you deal with the DSA. For sure, the European Commission helps. For sure, we want to make it as easy as possible, but still member states in the European Union are responsible for criminal law, and therefore we have this structure. What we have been at least achieving in both elements together is that very large online platforms or very large search engines in the DSA correspond 100% to the definition of the gatekeepers that are defined in the DMA. So you have at least this regulatory coherence, and it's even strengthened by the fact that the European Commission in both laws is responsible and the only responsible authority to apply the law. And that helps also for these big platforms in the international context to operate more easily because they have now one authority that they can go to discuss about all the questions they may have with the law. As I said to you already, and this leads me to the third element, in the international context, both laws are internal market legislation. They affect all companies that want to do business in the European Union. And they are therefore not discriminatory because no company is excluded if it respects and abides by the laws that are in the European Union and that are based on the values that we have in the European Union. Europe's approach respects fundamental values and Europe's model of the social market economy. I have already mentioned that. And that saying, it means that consumers are protected and the state only intervenes to set guardrails when industries become systematically non-competitive. In the geopolitical competition between European Union, Europe and China and others, the European Union has identified China as a systemic rival and economic competitor. Because of the overlap in ambition with the US, the EU is mostly cooperating with the United States on this, but addressing problems that have been brought into the markets by mostly American companies. This is for sure a very strong tension because on the one side, there are very strong common values, but on the other side, this means that the European Union has also the power and the responsibility to set borders to companies from a country that have the same values. But that doesn't exclude that Chinese or other companies from the world can operate in this market as they want if they respect these values that we have been putting into the law. Like that, I think obviously the cooperation is not without tensions, but we have now set up the Trade and Technology Council, where we want to speak at high level about all the questions that may arise in the process of applying. And that leads me to the last point, Ambassador, colleagues, and these are the challenges and opportunities for cooperation with other countries, including China. I think most of the platforms that cause the issues which inspire the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act are prohibited in China. For example, Facebook or Google have been there with limited activities, but at the same time, certain similarities exist as the more muscular approach of the Chinese government to deal with these tech platforms in recent years has shown. International relations and systemic rivalry did not fuel the DMA and the DSA. It was more a concern to ensure that the single market for services works better for the Europeans, but also for non-Europeans. And we would like to be seen as a sovereign actor that can adopt the laws it sees fit, as long as it is not discriminatory and respects the basic principles of the law. And I think like that, we offer a lot also to companies from China, because they are invited to use the opportunities that are given to all companies with the DMA and the DSA. And I think learning over time will be possible. The different approaches around the globe, including China and the European Union, in dealing with platforms will lead to different experiences, also to different problems that we may have to deal then again together. The challenges is for sure that beyond mature learning, space for cooperation is limited. The EU does not want the same level of state control that may be seen in some other areas of the world. We want this to be as democratic and as business orientated as possible in a strong framework that respects the laws that are in question. And this is in the DSA area, mostly criminal law. Therefore, I would like to conclude, Ambassador Matic, that most of these laws, as I said already, are internal market regulation. They are the first in the world to do so. And therefore, everyone, I'm sure, also in China, also in Asia, but also in the US and beyond, will watch very closely what it does and what it cannot do. There is space for cooperation on digital governance, and it's not limited only to mature learning, but also on all other questions, how online regulation is operating and how internet governance can be successful. And therefore, I'm looking forward for a very interesting debate. Thank you so much for your attention.
Dr. Schwab, thank you so much for your keynote address and a truly in-depth insight shared on this significant topic, which indeed is underlying some of the core elements of our democracies in the European Union. Moving on to our next keynote speaker, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Huiyao Wang, founder and the president of China's most influential non-governmental think tank, accredited with special UN consultative status, China Center for Globalization, or CCG. Dr. Huiyao Wang is the former counselor of the State Council of China, appointed by the Chinese premier. In addition, he serves as a vice chairman of China Association for International Economic Cooperation under the Ministry of Commerce. He is a vice chairman of China Talent Research Society under the Ministry of Human Resources and Social Security, and director of Chinese People's Institute of Foreign Affairs and China National Committee for Pacific Economic Cooperation, both organizations under the supervision of Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He is also vice chairman of China Public Relations Association. He furthermore holds professor and dean title at the Institute of Development of Southwest University of Finance and Economics, and is a member of the Advisory Committee for Global Competence Development at Tsinghua University. He is also steering committee member of Global Governance for the Digital Ecosystems, the Paris Peace Forum, Pandemic Action Network, and the Metropolis International. He is furthermore an advisory board member to the Duke Kunshan University and Richard Ivey Business School. Without further ado, Dr. Huiyao Wang, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Martin, and Your Excellency, Ambassador Steele, and Honorable Mr. Schwab, and distinguished panelists. Really, good evening from China, from Beijing. Yeah, so it's great. We have this webinar to talk about this Digital Market Act and Digital Service Act opportunities and challenges for EU-China relation. I think this is really a great discussion that we are really currently on. And I just returned from EU about 2 months ago. I was in Brussels in July, and we had a big meeting with EPC there and Degmon, and also we had quite a bit of discussion there. Center for China Globalization is really very keen to work with our European think tanks, colleagues with EU Asia Center and also EPC, because also we are working on EU Commission-funded project together. We have held many seminars, webinars in the past. So I think the topic today is really highly relevant. I mean, European are obviously ahead of time. I was also sitting on this, this you mentioned about this steering committee that established by CERE in Brussels, that is also participated by Pascalami, the former WTO Director General. So I attended quite a few their digital economy steering committee discussions. I think that China, EU, and including US are largely economically probably digital first world, if we can use that. Well developed, well advanced. China is the second largest digital economy and a country in the world, and also China now actually has a very large percentage of the digital economy driving its GDP now. Like China's economy is almost 40% is digital economy related, or if not more. So I think we're really coming at a crucial time that we have to find a way to get upgrades on the global governance, on the way we conduct business among each other, and also how we can put forward a global acceptable operating standards and regulations and all those things. So it's very important. I know that WTO has a digital forum that multilateral discussion is still going on. China is very interested to engage in digital dialogues. For example, China just applied to join DIPA, digital partnership agreement that proposed by New Zealand, Singapore, and Chile, and China actually officially applied that, and also China just recently officially set up a working group towards that. So I think digital economy of this Digital Market Act and Digital Service Act already adopted in the EU market is really significant. It's a great moves ahead. I think set some high standards and bars and then so for the future for China to learn and to of course to observe and then try to see if they can stimulate the Chinese domestic digital regulation and the standards to be set up. So I think this is good that we have some EU as probably pioneer on this and has already done something there. But as I know, there on a digital thing, on the internet, and in a virtual space, you have US on the one spectrum, you have EU on one spectrum, you have China on spectrum, whereas US is probably emphasize more freedom and all those things, and the EU is emphasized more about the privacy and how things are done, and then China's maybe emphasize a bit more on digital sovereignty and things like that. So how can we converge that? I really think we need more discussion and more working together on this issue. And so I think the very valuable that that current today's discussion are really highly relevant. What I think actually, we can put forward is that, of course, we'd love to get the digest of this webinar, that the outcome of the discussion and see how we can work together. what I can see is that China EU has a huge, enormous business potential. I mean, even though we are, have been specified by European Union as a systematic rivalry, but that means maybe we have a different system. We have been always have a different system for the last 5,000 years. I mean, but let's compete peacefully if we can, our Olympic style, that should be okay. I don't see a problem with that. So what I think is that we don't get this kind of a strategic rivalry that what the US has been proposing. I really admire that EU and European trying to be more strategic independence, and I think in the digital space and this certainly, I mean, EU can be more independent, strategically independent in its more pursuit of its regulations and standards. And China is like willing to work with that. I think China and EU already said something in a leadership summit on the digital space and also on the sustainable environmental, climate change area. So we like to see that continue. We like to see CAI, comprehensive agreement on investment, continue. We know that in November will come at the time that European Parliament, European Council will review that, whether they're going to extend sanctions, and the same for China will do that. But I would really propose let's really maybe we should abandon the sanction on both sides, and let's really facilitate the business community. We could probably abandon at the same time, but China is 6 hours ahead of time, which means China abandon first, and then you can follow. So I think that would be great to do. I think after 20th Party Congress, China will be more concentrated on the economy, which we can see from President Xi's working report yesterday. He's emphasized a lot on the economy, high quality growth, continue to work with our international friends, and we see that Chancellor Scholz is coming at the beginning of November. President Macron may come, December or January. We see really there's no really a big strategic difference that we may have. China would love to see EU got of this war with this Ukraine-Russian crisis that's currently going on. China like to promote that a peace end to the crisis. And so when I was at EPC Degamon conference we had in July there, I proposed that we should really have a G3 concept, probably working with Global South. So China, EU, US, it's really the three largest economy, in the world. Particularly US and EU and China. So why can't the three parties talk together and how they can help the Global South, how they can tackle climate change and digital space as well. So I think, let the three parties talk together, and China probably could help mediate a bit of this, Ukraine NATO fight with Russian, and EU can mediate a bit of the tension between China and the US. We see that EU as a more independent, as a third part. So let's not have a situation of a West versus the rest, or West versus China. EU is not the same as US. We have to work together. So I think that's probably the enormous opportunity we're seeing here in China for the EU. China now have a 400 million middle class. We see that China 20th Party Congress proposed China will reach a modernized society by 2035 and even further modernized in 2049. I'm sure they're going to have another probably 400 million middle class as time goes on. China has doubled its GDP in the last 10 years, and enormous progress has been made. So China become the largest trading nation with 130 countries. And then so I think China is lacking these more international exchanges on the digital regulations and services and best practices. I think European probably are more suitable to maybe more advanced in terms of the legislative process. And I would really like to see more corporations in that area. And we hope that we can continue to discuss this and we can really benefit from that, and so that we have a much more peacefully, more intertwined and more prosperous society, where the digital economy will bring us further into that future. So once again, I want to thank you for the invitation, and I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your address, Dr. Huiyao Wang. Without further ado, now I will shift further to our experts. I would first like to invite to the front Dr. Sebastian Hallensleben, who is the chair of the CEN-CENELEC JTC 21, where the European AI standards to underpin EU regulations are being developed. He is also a member of the expert advisory board of the EU StandICT program and the chair of the Trusted Information Working Group. He co-chairs the Classification and Risk Assessment Working Group in the OECD ONE.AI and has a role in the AI committees at IEC, Council of Europe, and UNESCO. Dr. Hallensleben heads the digitalization and artificial intelligence at the VDE, Association for Electrical, Electronic, and Information Technologies, where he's responsible for new products and services development, as well as for advising and developing frameworks for the German Parliament, several federal ministries, and the European Commission. He focuses particularly on the AI ethics, on handling the impact of generative AI, building privacy-preserving trust infrastructure, as well as the characterizing AI quality. Earlier in his work, Dr. Hallensleben worked on dialogue facilitation between academia, industry, and policymaking, as well as international infrastructure project development for waste, energy, and drinking water. Dr. Hallensleben, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation and the interesting discussion already so far. Arguing from my perspective as the chair of European AI standardization, many of the issues that we are seeing emerging from the DMA and the DSA will also be emerging from the AI Act. And the fundamental issue that is shared between those three major pieces of legislation is the question of jurisdiction and the question of sovereignty. We have a fundamental challenge, a fundamental unsolved challenge, in that we don't know, collectively, we don't know how jurisdiction in the physical geographic space maps to the digital space. In the realms of applicability of the DMA and the DSA, we're talking about the reach of content blocking. So geo-blocking, what does it mean? Where the content is produced, where the content is hosted, where the author of the content sits, where the person trying to access the content sits, which jurisdiction is actually applicable. The same for content that is illegal to own. So be it for commercial restrictions, for example, violation of copyright or intellectual property, or certain types of content, be it content with particular levels of violence, pornography, or in fact content with certain political properties. We've also got a major challenge that we have been grappling with from a European perspective with the jurisdiction over data. We've got the GDPR in the European Union, another earlier landmark piece of legislation, and we're struggling how to apply the jurisdiction of the GDPR. We are now on the third attempt to come to a conclusion between Europe and the US. Safe Harbor failed, Privacy Shield failed. We're now on this third attempt of trying to address that underlying issue of jurisdiction. So we do have a situation in the world where it's not really clear how geographic jurisdiction, political jurisdiction maps to the digital space. China, from my perspective, has chosen a path that is conceptually probably the most straightforward path, but that cannot really be copied by the rest of the world. So the digital space in China is to a large extent segregated from the digital space in the West, to use that very, very loose term. And that, of course, is a solution or a possible way of mapping political and geographic sovereignty to the digital space. It's not a path that the European Union or the US or many other countries want to follow for political reasons. As was pointed out earlier, we do have different outlooks here, and this is very unlikely to change. So we need different concepts to complement the kind of the segregation approach in the digital space. So the question is, how can we create jurisdiction in the digital space? How can we establish or decide jurisdiction in the digital space? Now, we do have a number of prior art, so to speak, that could inspire us in this area where jurisdiction is unclear. One example, for example, is spectrum use in telecommunications. Radio waves don't respect borders. So the question is, how do you come to an agreement over the use of a radio spectrum? And we do have the international structures with the ITU and other international bodies to agree on spectrum use. So that is an example of where we did solve the problem. Another area is maritime law. We have got the high seas where it's not really clear which jurisdiction applies. Is it the nationality of the captain? Is it the flag under which this ship is registered? Is it the country in which the owner of the ship is registered? So we've already got a clash of jurisdictions, or an overlap of jurisdictions, and over several decades, maritime law has come to an international consensus on how to deal with that. WTO was already mentioned. I'd like to specifically point out the area of intellectual property handling and of patents. We've also got prior art, so to speak, for overlapping jurisdiction as far as tax systems are concerned. Although it's unsatisfactory in that most of the solution consists of a plethora of double taxation agreements, but at least between pairs of countries, that problem has been addressed, but it also highlights how complex it is. And of course, we do have in the very physical space a long-standing tradition of addressing clashes of jurisdiction when we talk about embassies and the kind of the status of embassies, when we talk about visa, when we talk about the justice system. If people from one nation commit offenses in another nation, how do we deal with that? Who is responsible? So we have a long list of examples of where overlapping jurisdictions have been addressed in multiple ways. And I'd like to also point out that this issue has been particularly severe for modern technologies such as artificial intelligence. It's very easy to imagine a case where data to train an AI system came from China. The model came from the US. The company that operates the AI system sits in Sweden. The servers are in France. The people affected by the decisions of the AI system sit in Brazil. That's an easy, that's not an unusual constellation. So we have 4, 5, 6 jurisdictions that all can lay some sort of claim on trying to address how certain things should happen or not happen. And within the scope of DMA and DSA, we can construct similar examples. So we urgently need solutions, and I'd like to conclude with a very hopeful experience that I've had when I was co-chairing an IEC International Committee on standardizing AI ethics. I say co-chairing because the other co-chair was a Chinese colleague. And there was a lot of skepticism initially around, can we talk AI ethics at the global level? Because the cultural outlook, political situation is so different. And it turned out that we can, because we managed to separate and slice and dice the issue of ethics between the issues that can be standardized at the global level. For example, ways of talking about AI ethics, ways of describing characteristics such as transparency, and also ways of describing different risk levels. separating that, where global consensus is possible, from issues that are very much sovereign issues and jurisdiction issues around what use of AI is acceptable in a given application. So that acceptability is something that is very much different between countries, between blocks. And we shouldn't even try to build international consensus there. So that slicing and dicing of the issue, that successful slicing and dicing of the issue, could also inspire us in finding a solution for overlapping jurisdictions in the realm of the DMA and the DSA. Thank you.
Dr. Hallensleben, thank you so much for also, giving us this bright direction for the conversation forward. Welcoming our second expert, I'm really thrilled to welcome Ms. Mireia Paulo. She is a senior consultant at the Chinese law firm ANZ and arbitrator and mediator at the Shanghai International Arbitration Center. She has worked in several countries, but more than a decade in China. In addition, she works as a head of management at CEAC, Jean Monnet Center of Excellence and Research, and is a research associate at Ruhr-Universität of Bochum in Germany. Ms. Paulo is also a member of a variety of research organizations and business associations. She regularly delivers lectures at European and Chinese universities and trainings for companies and governmental agencies. Her major research interests includes internet and data governance, Europe-Asia and EU-China relations. Ms. Paulo, the virtual floor is yours. You're still muted? I think, yes, now it should work.
Sorry, now.
Perfect.
Well, dear Matic, dear colleagues, thank you very much for invitation, and also thank you very much for organizing today's webinar. I'm delighted to be here, but also to exchange views in this very timely topic. I think many key points have already been said by previous speakers, but I would like to complement those from a more Chinese context and also focusing on opportunities for discussion and exchange information. So based on different sources, for example, and focusing on the US regulation, mainly companies that are likely to be identified, for example, gatekeepers, for the time being are more US firms, right, more than Chinese. So when it comes to the impacts or influence on EU-China relations of these two regulations, time-wise, in a short time, we see a bit less impact, right? So for example, at this moment, those potential companies, so Chinese platforms that could be identified as gatekeeper are not fulfilling those thresholds yet, but eventually they will, right? And when this happens, I don't foresee high impact implications for this relation for several reasons. So one is, I think it was already pointed before, but there is a similar tendency for regulating big tech and large online companies in online platforms in China. So for example, everybody remembers when internet was referred as Wild West, right? So similar context has taken place in China in the past decade with a small number of domestic giant tech companies. This is because the rapid growth of the industry, characterized maybe by a laissez-faire approach or limited regulatory interventions in order to develop the internal market. But currently now, like Europe, Chinese policymakers and regulators are also trying to regulate domestic digital market to address the monopolistic power of tech giants, right? And also the potential abuses vis-a-vis business users and consumers. So similar to the DMA, Chinese regulators are also concerned with this competitiveness and fairness of digital market. And also like DSA goal, the new regulations also try to improve online safety or regulation content. So for example, since 2020, we have Alibaba or Meituan. Meituan is like a platform for different things, shopping, travel, entertainment, food. But many other companies have been investigated and also fined for their involvement in monopoly. And we have, for example, Didi. Didi is the biggest ride-hailing platform, right? So was also inspected and fined with roughly in euros will be something like 1.2 billion euros, something like that. So that's a little bit resembles the fine, no, imposed by the Commission on Google or its parent Alphabet, right, on abuse of dominance proceedings. So in both jurisdictions, regulation seeks to ensure a level play field, so that the emerging competitors do not get squashed, and that maybe you are thinking in Europe for the SMEs, but in China we have the big ones, but also we have the small ones, right? And also they try to set up rules of conduct so that users, especially business users of large digital platforms, are treated fairly. So in opinions, at least in mainland China, it is possible to serve a positive attitude toward DMA and DSA, particularly in the legal industry. So there is quite a lot of interest to further understand these two pieces, but also enforcement mechanisms. I think enforcement is one important element here. But also there are other reasons that I don't foresee, or a second reason I would say that I don't foresee this being a challenge is the adaptability to market and regulatory changes. So think in Chinese terms, right, or in Chinese context. So the Chinese market has been changing rapidly. It's a very dynamic market as well, right? And also we have a very modern legal system. So it barely 40 years after the opening up, right, with Deng Xiaoping. So Chinese companies are already used to constant changes in the domestic regulation, which means paying higher compliance costs and taking higher risks to adapt to new regulatory requirements and market conditions. So it's now just about adapting business models, but also conducting technical and procedural changes. So they're kind of used to get out of the comfort zone. So meaning that if they go to a foreign market and they need to comply with foreign market regulation, that should be something already expected, right? And the third reason I found is that there is also this adaptability to different legal systems or jurisdiction requirements, as previous speaker mentioned as well, right? So Chinese platforms, they often have the separate versions for domestic and global markets. So we could mention that, for example, a well-known case is ByteDance, right, on Chinese Douyin and global TikTok. They do not interoperate, right? So this make compliance with new EU regulations slightly easier for them than for others. So we see in the past years, right, we witnessed a shift in the Chinese regulatory framework. So it is not surprising that new legislation is issued to regulate online platform behaviors and related issues such as consumer protection or data protection, even content moderation and suppression of fair competition. So these steps somehow echo the European tendency to level up the regulatory scrutiny of the online platforms. Of course, with differences in context, right? But in that sense, I would like to mention some of those strengths in legal common bonds that perhaps it could bring chances to discuss more or to exchange information and more global cooperation, or at least bilateral. So for example, we have in the regulatory side, right, we have the anti-monopoly guidelines for platform economy, right? For example, this sends a very clear message to the online platforms that antitrust enforcement could be activated to counter anti-competitiveness practices. We also have the anti-monopoly law that has been amended this year. And for example, the Article 22 stipulates that operators with market dominance shall not use these algorithms, technologies, platform rules to engage in the abuse of market dominance. But we also have different, for example, there are two interesting guidelines, although they are in draft for comment, about the classification and grading of internet platform, which is a little bit similar to the DMA. So it divides internet platforms into super, large, and SME platforms, right? According to user scale, business types, and also restrictions, capabilities. However, there's a difference in terms of specific amounts in the standards of user scale. And then, for example, the guideline for implementing entity responsibilities of internet platforms here I think there's also room for discussion, because it clarifies the division of responsibilities of platforms, for example, in security audit, in anti-monopoly, anti-fair competition. However, it's not as detailed as the DMA. And so legal experts, scholars in China, we also suggest that obligations of these different platforms should be further specified in detail, and perhaps it could be also discussed with in light of DMA, right? But there are many other regulations and laws that we don't need to obviously mention all of them, like in the civil code, like the Piet, etc., etc. However, I just wanted to give you a few examples that give us certain room or certain scope for discussion, and I think especially for exchange practices. And I think, for example, as a previous speaker was mentioning, this distinctions and in terms of jurisdictions or sovereignty should not undermine those points where we can, or those areas where we can further discuss. And in that, for example, there is another issue that I think we could all learn. It's in terms of the enforcement of all these new regulations, right? Because one thing is to issue them, and the other thing will be to implement them, right? And to surveillance them. And so that it's maybe a very tough task, rather in either in mainland China than in the EU, right? So with this, I don't want to extend myself too much, but I stop here. Thank you very much, and very much welcome for the debate later on.
Thank you so much, Ms. Paulo. Last but certainly not least, I'm delighted to invite our last expert of the dialogue today, which is Ms. Mireia Adele Carai. Her research explores the history of international law in East Asia and investigates how China's rise as a global power shapes norms and redefines the international distribution of power. She co-leads the research initiative Mapping Global China and is an author of Sovereignty in China, a genealogy of a concept since 1840s, and co-editor of the China Question 2, Critical Insights into US-China Relations. Before joining the NYU Shanghai, she was a recipient of 3-year Marie Curie Fellowship at the KU Leuven. She was also the fellow at the Italian Academy of Columbia University, Princeton, Harvard, China, and the World Program, Max Weber Program of the European University Institute of Florence and New York University Law School. Without further ado, Ms. Carai, the virtual floor is yours.
Yeah, so thank you so much for the kind invitation. It's great to be part of this panel with really excellent speakers. Today I want to bring more the transatlantic perspective into the floor and the US, because I'm working in an American institution in China. And so the US has been quite critical about the DSA and DMA because it targets US big companies, Alphabet, Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, and Meta. And these have created concern about the strategic posturing of the US vis-a-vis the EU vis-a-vis the US, and the possible geopolitical implication. The acts, in fact, will give rise to an EU competition law system that discriminates against the US companies, benefiting the EU and subsidized Chinese tech companies, and allowing China to achieve long-term geopolitical gains in Europe. If we look at China, Chinese companies like Alibaba, Tencent, and Baidu have been making serious efforts to expand their global footprint beyond the home market of 1.3 billion consumers. Currently, Alibaba and many Chinese tech companies will not hit the threshold needed to be considered a gatekeeper under the DMA. But I think it's just a matter of time, because there is an intent to expand. Still, the fact that they don't hit the threshold might be a problem if they do not, because then they can access intellectual property, internal tools, trade secrets from the gatekeepers, and expand consequently their presence in the European Union. And this seems to be particularly concerning in light of the Chinese government plan to oversee data collected by its tech giants. And it's very difficult to separate what Chinese government does and the private companies. So we saw it, for instance, with Huawei. So the EU should keep that in mind, but rather than discriminate on Chinese companies because they're Chinese, they should create clear rules that addresses, for instance, any foreign government control over data. Also, I want to point out that as it has emerged from the panel that Chinese government has accelerated digital economy regulations in the last years. And in 2021, it issued the Personal Information Protection Law that is the first comprehensive set of rules around data collection and protection in China digital economy. Is a sort of counterpart to the EU General Data Protection Regulation. And this is part of a global trend that regulate big tech companies, scrutinize their behaviors, limiting anti-competitive behaviors, especially related to user data. And in this sense, I think that as Professor Wang was saying, EU and China could collaborate to develop a regulatory framework on big tech companies and are already aligned in some sense in establishing accountability mechanism for digital platforms. And while the DMA for now does not affect big Chinese companies such as Alibaba or TikTok, as again, they don't reach the gatekeeper threshold, the EU has still discretionary power to investigate companies that do not meet the formal definition of gatekeeper. And so Chinese companies could also be investigated for services that they provide in Europe. And as in for any gatekeeper, Chinese company like TikTok will be forced to open up in the same way as US companies or any company and then they should disclose proprietary information, user data, internal tool, details of technical infrastructures and other elements. Otherwise, they will be out excluded from the EU market. And in the proposed DMA, the European Commission has not given clear consideration or evident consideration for now to the future of Chinese digital technology firms in Europe. And again, the EU should not a priori ban Chinese companies, but define the legal space within which the Chinese company or any company for the matter can operate in Europe. It should not be discriminatory toward China, but give due consideration and weight to Chinese state subsidies, the lack of reciprocity with Chinese market that is basically sealed from the rest of the digital world, and it makes it almost impossible for the US and EU firms to make in-market access. And I think the EU should also give due consideration to Chinese authoritarian practices at home and the role of Chinese government in controlling data collected by Chinese tech companies. But again, I think that it should not discriminate against China, but just create general rules and apply that. Otherwise, it becomes too political. With regard to the transatlantic relation, because that's a big concern, right? That now the EU is targeting US companies and now leave space to China. I think that's not granted at all. And since Biden came to power, there has been effort to strengthening the transatlantic cooperation in many respects, including in dealing with China, that has been defined by both sides as a competitor and a critical challenge for the 21st century. And the pandemic made the EU and the US realize their vulnerabilities and dependency on China for their supply chain and the need for diversification. And also the war in Ukraine brought the EU and the US close together and generated even more sort of distrust toward China. That's the feeling I had also when I was in Europe, especially now there's a lot of concern about what Russia and China are doing in terms of authoritarianism and so forth. This is the feeling. I don't necessarily share it, but that's how the EU feels and the US feel. And there's been a recognition by the transatlantic partners of the growing challenge posed by China and its authoritarian and non-market approach to the digital world. And there's been also a call to have EU and the US joint approaches on shared values to digital platform regulations. And I think one of the answers was the EU-US Trade and Technology Council that was established to fund grant between the EU and US, based again on democratic values, freedom, and human rights. And so I think that paired with Biden administration plan to rein in big tech, EU-US shared values and interests and cooperation that has been heightened by the Ukraine war, I think that any EU geopolitical standing seemingly pro-China and against the US promoted by the DMA and DSA will be quite limited. And this can also be seen with Huawei, where a mix of geopolitical and security consideration have led most of the EU countries to follow the EU's lead and block Huawei completely. But even here, we see some strategic autonomy of the EU because some countries did not block or completely Huawei. So last things overall, while currently the European Commission has not given evident consideration to the future of Chinese tech companies in Europe and the risk related to tie up US big tech while leaving Chinese tech company free to flourish, I think that the EU geopolitical consideration, transatlantic ties, shared democratic and market values will lead Europe to take steps to regulate and possibly limit the expansion of Chinese digital technologies in Europe. And there are already screening mechanisms in place, and it's just a matter of time, also for Chinese to reach the threshold. That said, the EU cannot achieve technological or digital sovereignty alone. It still lacks production capacity, big tech companies, and digital infrastructure. So it still needs China and US big tech companies. And I really hope that there will be a trilateral collaboration in developing a regulatory framework on big tech. I think that's key for the future. Thank you.
You muted, Matic.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much for your contribution, Ms. Karai. Now we've concluded with a kind of part of statements, and maybe we have enough time to also open up a bit of the discussion. I would like to raise one of the points which also kind of was reoccurring throughout the address, both of Dr. Huiyao Wang and our chairman, and then also partly relating to the note of Dr. Schwab. There is kind of a sense or shared opinion that there needs to be a dialogue also on the tech side, and I think Dr. Huiyao Wang, you raised in one of your recent conversations that there is a need to have also a T20 summit in a way. That we've been hearing a lot also from the expert that there needs to be this trilateral dimension. Where do you, I mean, the kind of moving forward in terms of the dialogue on DMA and DSA on EU-China relation, can this be resolved purely on this bilateral spectrum, or should there really be this trilateral framework underpinned with strong dialogue of, let's say, technological players in sort of a T20 summit, so Tech 20 summit?
Yes. Yeah, thank you, Mary. I also hear clearly all the panelists speech very well, well put in many ways. What I actually propose, of course, I have two proposals. One is for the T3. Let's have a digital summit of some kind. I mean, if we have more, I mean, we can expand that on climate, on many things. So I really want to see EU play more active role, given now we're having more tense US-China relationship. So that's number one. Number two, I think on those digital area, I think somehow maybe we need to give industry and think tank and maybe policymakers a room to talk. So particularly the industry. So what I mean is that, for example, Huawei got a lot of problem operating in the US, maybe ZTE or even TikTok and things like that. Google, Facebook, Twitter have a lot of problem in China, can't do that. So why can't we have a D20? I propose D20. I proposed that actually at the Paris Peace Forum. The digital 20, the largest 20 digital companies in the world. Why can't they come together, sit down, participated by the policymakers, but also think tanks and academia to hear what's they are thinking of, because I think those largest digital companies, they want to operate globally, but then they have to follow the rules of EU, China, US. So it'd be great. I mean, let's see what are the common denominator for all those largest digital 20 companies. So that's what I'm proposing, because for the G20, we have T20, which is the think tank 20. We have Y20, young 20. We have the B20, business 20. But why can't we have a D20? Let's have a digital, because really digital is the way to go for the future. So I would really propose this digital 20 together with the G20 platform, and talk about policy issues, participate by the think tank, all the stakeholders. Really, let's get the business, because they share their language. They probably can find out what are the obstacles among each other, and then they can probably give some ideas for the policymakers and regulators to really work on. So rather than they are blocked each other by the government, I think why not they work together and find something in common. So that's my proposal.
Thank you so much. Maybe we have any contribution from Dr. Schwab?
Well, that's very kind that we can exchange here. I mean, obviously, there is the issue that private companies are not hindered to speak to each other whenever they want, not within the European Union, not across the Atlantic, neither across the Pacific. And therefore, I think this is for sure something that can help. But the key question that we have to address is, what are the basic rights, the basic values that the legislation has been introducing? And with the experiences that we have seen in the past, the boundaries for private companies in digital have to be respective of what the law is prescribing. And that is important for citizens, but it's also important for companies. And therefore, I think such an exercise of big companies in the tech sector speaking each other would in any event need a complement with small companies of the sector speaking to each other, and also citizens speaking to each other, because there are questions of data privacy against surveillance. There are questions of competition with data leveraging. I have mentioned it. And all this can be of concern to a company in China, to a company in Brazil, to a company in the US, and to the company in Europe. And the same for gatekeeping companies that have already that large data networks. So I think it's important that we keep this in mind.
Thank you. Do we have maybe some commentary points also from the experts? Yes, Dr. Hallensleben.
Yeah, just picking up on the point of the role of the big platforms. We have to recognize, I think, that big platforms are limited by the business model that they've built for themselves and that they are thriving on. Big platforms typically thrive on collecting and selling data. And citizens have become used to that business model and have accepted it. We just have to admit that this is the case. So any regulation that tries to, in some sense, improve big platforms or kind of curb certain developments on big platforms that we don't want to see, have to be seen in the context of running against the fundamental business platform of those business model of those platforms. So what I'm trying to say is that we will not manage to regulate big platforms into being something other than they are already. We can curb the worst excesses, but we will not regulating them. To make it concrete, we will never regulate Facebook into being a location for constructive political discourse. It's not going to happen, because that's not how Facebook is constructed and the business model it has. So that puts an onus on policymaking, I think, to do two things. One, to create the environment for new types of platforms that are constructed in different ways to emerge, to gain traction. I believe this is part of what to kind of have the next generation of platforms, different types of platforms. And the second thing that policy making needs to consider, or might need to consider, is, well, if we want to have constructive dialogue between citizens, between policymakers, how does that look in the digital space? The formats that we have are very, very rudimentary, and I would like to see a much more advanced discussion on how political debate, that is important for any system of government, for any system of policy making, can be conducted in the digital space, and what structures need to be created to foster it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Any points also from Ms. Paulo or Carai?
From my side, I ratify what previous speakers have said. Of course, I fully agree. Although from practice, I think we can not only have this dialogues at high level, such as EU-China digital dialogue, but I think in the technical side, it will be very useful as well. One side, as they mentioned, is for industry, not just the big ones, but also the SMEs, but also working groups, right? We can have, I think, for example, in China, it will be also, or from China, I think it will be also very welcome to have from bar associations, for example, or from competent legal authorities, discussions on this type of regulation, content, provision, jurisdiction, enforcement, also for criminal law, cross-border criminal law, right? Definition of concepts. But also we could serve practices, right? Because as I was saying, even if the implementation of certain laws and regulations are slightly different, but I'm sure we can work together and improve those, especially for common practice, for example, or cross-border issues. But I also think it could be added from universities. Why not, right? We need more research, in-depth research with comparative studies, right? And interdisciplinary expert teams, and bringing together. I don't think this segregation of high-level politicians, big companies, small companies, I think we should have certain working groups, you know, like we had with AI ethics, for example, that it was mentioned before, different disciplines, different levels as well. I think that could solve or create, more than solve, but create platforms, right, for discussion. What I really discourage, and I think I feel kind of personally obliged to somehow highlight, is that I'm more concerned also in trying to in the power of words, right? Especially when it comes to this blocking narratives, and also this kind of strategies sometimes, or measures that sometimes might be counterproductive, trying to divide in digital affairs into blocks, right? Or into north or advancing economies. I think we should overcome that and try to avoid the escalation of more tension and conflict that I would like really to stress and see more in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Any closing points also from Ms. Carai?
Just very briefly, I think that I think it's very important that the EU start a dialogue also with China, and I would love to see a trilateral dialogue and cooperation, maybe even establishing a trade and technology council that integrate also China in it, because the risk is that we develop, like that China becomes more and more isolated. It creating a completely fragmented internet and platforms. I think that's, we don't want that. I think that's not in the interest of society and broader community. And again, I think really taking advantage of the momentum, both in the Biden administration and also China with all the new regulation that it made to push this momentum and really try to create a more global tech regulation. Tech regulation. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And last words also from our chairman. You're muted still. You need to unmute. Sorry.
It's okay now? Hello?
It works. It works. Perfect.
It works. Now, as I said, I've been listening very carefully this afternoon, and I as a retired diplomat, I'm always promoting, dialogue. And I see here, this is a subject where dialogue is absolutely crucial for the future of even of humanity. I mean, we have dialogues on environment, we have dialogues on trade. I think digital economy should be part of that dialogue in the future. The idea which was mentioned by Dr. Wang is on a kind of digital 20 or a summit, 20 summit. Why not? I mean, there are a couple of ideas which should certainly falling into fertile ground and needs more reflection. So I must say I felt this discussion very, very fruitful indeed.
Perfect. Thank you so much. To wrap it up, on behalf of the Europe Asia Center, I would really like to once again extend a very sincere thank you to each and one of you. Thank you to Ambassador Steele, to Dr. Schwab, to Dr. Huiyao Wang for your keynote addresses and for participating in the dialogue, as well to the three experts, Dr. Hallensleben, Ms. Paulo, and Dr. Karai, for your critical contribution. Thank you so much, and hopefully this can be just the start of more fruitful discussions that will follow and ideas that could potentially spin off from it.